Alright, so this section is essentially on gas exchange. I briefly mentioned, I believe in class the other day, that we want to try to adjust our terminology and that respiration for most biologists occurs at a cellular level, and that's a process which occurs after the oxygen has been delivered to the cell in the case of aerobic respiration. So gas exchange is getting the oxygen out of the transport system into the cells where it is needed, and ventilation is a complex system that will facilitate the delivery of those gases. Okay, so hopefully throughout this lecture you will be able to do the following. You should be able to distinguish between respiration, ventilation, and gas exchange. Explain why some organisms need more complex delivery systems or ventilation systems. You should be able to describe the process of gas exchange, how it comes out of the cell and into the transport system or vice versa, and then explain the ventilation process in mammals, such as us. Okay. So respiration occurs on a cellular level, while ventilation typically occurs on an organism level. So these would be organisms that have advanced organ systems, such as ourselves. Respiration is the process by which glucose is broken down to release ATP, or energy, and in this case it would be aerobic respiration in the presence of oxygen. Whereas with ventilation, we're trying to ensure that the gases can reach the interior of these larger organs. So if you envision a cell in the inside of your liver, there's virtually no way that oxygen could diffuse through your skin and all the way into that cell into the interior of your liver. So we need a much more sophisticated system to deliver these gases to where they need to go. Now remember, respiration occurs in all organisms, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic, but ventilation really only occurs in more advanced organisms. All right, so let's begin by talking about gas exchange. Obviously, gas exchange is going to involve exchange of gases. So in this case, it will be between the organism and its environment. What we're primarily focusing on here is getting oxygen into the body and getting CO2, which is a byproduct of metabolic processes and is a waste product for us. We need to get that out. The overarching process by which this takes place is diffusion, so it's passive transport between cells in the lungs and the bloodstream. Then once the bloodstream delivers the cells or the oxygen to where it needs to go, that oxygen will need to come out of the bloodstream and into the cells where it is needed. So in order to have diffusion, we have to establish a concentration gradient. You have to have a difference in oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations across those membranes in order for diffusion to take place so the gases can move from high concentration to low concentration. As I previously mentioned, this is passive transport and does not require ATP. So if we look at a diagram of the gas exchange in the lungs, the superior vena cava and the inferior as well is going to, receive deoxygenated blood. Now at this point, that blood has low levels of oxygen and high levels of CO2. It goes through the, right chambers of the heart and then goes on the pulmonary artery out to the lungs where the gas exchange will take place. So we'll go through the structure of the lungs, but there are these little sacs called alveoli, and that is where the exchange is going to take place. So ideally we want to have oxygen coming from the environment into these alveolar structures, and then that oxygen will diffuse across those membranes into the membrane of the blood vessel so that it can, be carried by the transport system. And then the carbon dioxide will move the opposite direction so it can eventually be expelled. So with the heart-lung system, we bring deoxygenated blood into the heart, pass it to the lungs, pass the oxygenated oxygenated blood back to the heart, and then out the aorta to the rest of the body. And of course, you should be pretty familiar with the route of oxygen and deoxygenated blood in the heart by now, but if you need another look at it, there's a diagram for you. And if you need some additional, visuals of these, you can certainly click on that and watch the little animation if you choose. All right, so now we want to talk about just a really basic overview of what ventilation is. We'll get into the components and exactly how it happens after a bit. So ventilation is the physical process of moving air in and out of lungs. As I said previously, we cannot get oxygen out of the environment and into our bodies without having a concentration gradient between the lungs and the bloodstream. Why do we need it? I kind of already went over this, but we have to be able to get oxygen into our cells for cellular respiration to take place, and we need to get rid of carbon dioxide. Remember, really large organisms, we have a high volume to surface area ratio, so there's no way we can get oxygen to our internal tissues without some type of delivery system. So this ventilation system is also used to maintain these concentration gradients in these little structures in the lungs called alveoli. Those are like little air sacs. All right, so here's some examples of ventilation systems in multicellular organisms. Insects have tracheal tubes that connect the exterior of their body to the interior. They're just little holes, usually typically right underneath the wings, and this would allow for better diffusion. Fish have gills, which are very rich in capillaries, so we have a big blood supply coming in there. They have many finger-like projections, and obviously that greatly increases the surface area. With mammals, our lungs are very thin. They're moist, which facilitates diffusion of gases, and we have a very large surface area for gas exchange. Once again, lungs require a concentration gradient. We're going to bring oxygen-rich air in to the oxygen-poor blood, then diffusion can take place across those membranes. Now, mammals also have a circulatory system with the heart, which helps keep moving the deoxygenated blood to the lungs so that this process can take place, and then it will deliver the oxygenated blood to the tissues. It also helps to constantly maintain that concentration gradient. All right, so let's look at some of the structures in the ventilation system. You have your mouth or your nose. Air is going to enter or exit there. Then it's going to into your trachea. Your trachea is surrounded by little rings of cartilage. Some of you saw those when we did the sheep heart dissection. This keeps your trachea from collapsing. Then the trachea will split into two branches. These are the bronchi. So these are the two main branches off the trachea. And then there are lungs. Then, as those bronchi go down into the lung tissue, they begin to branch out into smaller and smaller branches. Those are referred to as bronchioles. And so here's a general diagram. So you can see the two main branches labeled bronchus, and then you have the bronchioles, which are all the little smaller branches off the bronchi. And then the little grape-like clusters, those are called alveoli. Singular would be alveolus. So let's talk about these alveoli a little bit. These are the site of the actual gas exchange. So the gas exchange does not take place in your trachea. Your trachea will simply help deliver the oxygen down into the lungs, where it will arrive ultimately at the terminal of the bronchioles, and that's where the alveoli are at. So these alveoli are arranged like little clusters of grapes, and each one of them will be connected to a tube, one of those little branches called a bronchiole. They are very well adapted for gas exchange. There's a particular type of cell that are referred to as type 1 pneumocytes. this gives you a massive surface area. Look at the number of alveoli you have. That's about 700 million alveoli. It creates a surface area of approximately 70 square meters inside your lungs. If you imagine a 70 square meter plot, laid out, that is much, much bigger than your body surface area. Another way that these are very specialized is the alveolar layers are very thin. They're only one layer of epithelial cells, and then they're very moist. So this allows gases to diffuse through a little layer of liquid. They dissolve and can diffuse much more easily if the membranes are moist. And this liquid is produced by a specialized type of cell called type 2 pneumocytes. So the type 1 pneumocytes are where the gas exchange is going to take place. The type 2 pneumocytes in these alveoli are going to constantly be secreting fluid to keep the surfaces moist. Okay, so there's another diagram of the alveoli. And if you look at the diagram on the right, these alveoli are surrounded by little bundles of capillaries. That is where the gas exchange is really going to take place so that the oxygen can come out of the alveoli and into the bloodstream. And then the carbon dioxide can come out of the bloodstream into the alveoli. It's a waste product, and then it can be expelled or exhaled. So if we look at the interchange between the vessel, as I just described, the goal is to be getting oxygen out of the alveoli into the bloodstream, and then to pick up that waste product, CO2, get it out of the capillary or bloodstream into the alveoli so that it can then exit the body. All right, there's a very good blood supply to these alveoli, and there's a whole network of capillaries that you just saw in the diagram. They wrap around these clusters of the alveoli. They carry blood and gases away, and so this is constantly happening. So once the oxygen comes out of the bloodstream into the alveoli, now we just flip that concentration gradient. Now keep in mind the blood's going to continue to move forward, but now it's deoxygenated blood in the bloodstream. There's another diagram showing how both the deoxygenated and oxygenated capillaries are just branching all over, and they're contacting those alveoli. All right, so now let's get into the mechanism of it. Your diaphragm is a sheet of muscle essential to the ventilation system. We already looked at that with your model. Okay, so mechanisms of ventilation. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because you already made your model. Inspiration is what you think of as inhaling. So the way this happens, your diaphragm contracts, it pulls down. Then your external intercostal muscles contract. So this is going to pull the rib cage up and out. Simultaneously, the internal intercostal muscles will relax because they would be working opposite the external ones. Your abdominal muscles relax. This is referred to as antagonistic movement. When one type of muscle fiber contracts and on the opposite side of the movement it relaxes, that's antagonistic movement. So now when this happens, the lung volume is going to increase appreciably, which means the gas pressure decreases, and then air is going to move in, so we have a pressure gradient. That means we have low pressure in the lungs, higher pressure comparatively out in the atmosphere so that air will move in. Now when you exhale, this is typically called expiration. With expiration, it's essentially the opposite of inspiration. Your diaphragm is going to relax, so it springs back up into that little umbrella shape. The internal intercostal muscles are going to contract while the external relax. That's going to move the rib cage down and in. Once again, that's antagonistic movement. Your abdominal muscles are going to contract, and this is going to vastly decrease the volume in the lungs, which will increase the pressure, and then air will move out because you have a pressure gradient. So nature always likes to try to balance these things out. So before you exhale, the pressure of gases is higher in your lungs than outside in the atmosphere, so the air goes out to balance. If you want to look at some animations, I've provided a link here. And there's also a lung cancer video, which I would strongly recommend that you watch, as there may be a question or two about lung diseases. So that's it for the ventilation and respiration and gas exchange section. And so please come in if you have any questions and let me know so I can clarify and explain anything you may need additional help with. Thanks.